This summer, I read 3 fantasy novels, 1 sci fi novel, 1 sci fi series, 2 ancient classics, 2 graphic novels, 2 nonfiction slash instructional books, 1 biography, 1 memoir, and a bunch of other books that I just don't know how to categorize. What's up, readers? I am Adam, aka A Dude Who Reads, and today I thought it would be fun to take every single book that I read over the summer and rank them from my least favorite up to my favorite, just cuz. And this is going to be a difficult exercise because, as you just heard, the books that I read over the summer are not similar. They're pretty different. And so this list is going to be a little bit all over the place, but that's part of the fun of it. And I hope you'll stick around. And specifically, I hope you stick around to hear what my number 1 is, because I think it might surprise you, because it definitely surprised me. With that, let's get into it. Starting with number 17, and don't worry, I'm not actually going to go through 17 different individual books. Some of these are going to get grouped together, so we'll actually have less than 17 sections here. But at 17 on the list, I have The Iliad by Homer. Now, just to be fair, this is kind of a cop-out, because the reason this is ranked at the very bottom of my list is not because of the story itself, but it's because of this specific translation of the Iliad. So this is the Wordsworth Classics edition of the Iliad, and it's the Chapman translation. My issue with this translation is that when it comes to picking a translation of any work, there's a bunch of different things that you need to look for, but I think prime amongst them is 1, readability, and 2, faithfulness to the original source. Chapman's translation of the Iliad fails on both accounts. First of all, I have read my fair share of ancient classics, but the prose in this version of the Iliad is so dense that I found myself having to stop, reread passages, and even pick up other editions of this book to try and understand what was going on. And this isn't even the first time I've read the Iliad. So that's number 1. The second thing that irked me about Chapman's translation of the Iliad is it's not even that faithful to the original text. If you read the introduction to this edition, it goes out of its way to say that Chapman tried to capture the spirit of what Homer was trying to say rather than the literal meaning of what Homer was trying to say, and in so doing, he actually created prose of his own. And so to some degree, this version of the Iliad is as much Chapman's as it is Homer's. So when you put all that stuff together, this specific translation of the Iliad is by far one of the worst translations of an ancient work that I have ever got my hands on. And I even went so far as to give up halfway through. And instead what I did was I downloaded the Amazon Classics version of the Iliad, which is free for Prime members. And I actually finished reading that version, which may not be the best translation of the Iliad out there, but it is infinitely more understandable than this one. It was written around the same time. Both of these translations were produced in the 17th century. But the Amazon Classics edition is just a lot more readable. The only downside to the Amazon Classics edition is that whereas Chapman's translation is translated from the ancient Greek, the Amazon Classics translation, which was translated by, I can't remember the name, forgive me, was actually translated from the Latin. So as a result, when you read it, all of the Greek gods and deities and so on and so forth are actually using the Latin names or the Roman names. So Zeus becomes Jupiter, and Athena becomes Minerva, and so on and so forth. But if you can get past that, the Amazon Classics edition of the Iliad is infinitely more readable. But I am going to keep looking for an even better translation. So if anyone out there has any suggestions, hit me up. At number 17 on the list, I have The Burning God by R.F. Kuang, which is the third in the Poppy Wars trilogy. Now, I want to go on the record here as saying I probably wouldn't even have read this book if I hadn't bought all 3 books in the trilogy for dirt cheap as audiobooks. And so that's the only reason I actually finished this trilogy, is because I listened through to the end on audio. And otherwise, I don't think I would have made it to book 3 in this trilogy. And I know I'm in the minority on this. A lot of people love The Poppy Wars by R.F. Kuang. Me personally, I don't get it. It's not because I have issues with the darkness or the grimness or any of those types of things. A lot of the reasons why people give why R.F. Kuang's The Poppy Wars is so good is because it illustrates the true nature of war. But I don't really see that as being a huge selling point. I don't have an issue with violence in my fantasy. A lot of my favorite fantasy is relatively dark, but in the Poppy Wars, my issue with this series in general is the fact that the violence doesn't actually seem to advance the plot in any way, shape, or form. It seems to be gratuitous. And not only that, the violence, in addition to a lot of the other things that happen to the main character, don't actually seem to change this character at all. And when I'm reading fiction, one of the things I'm looking for is a character arc, if not for multiple characters, at least for the main protagonist. And in this instance, the main protagonist starts in book 1 as a certain type of person and ends at the end of book 3, frankly, not all that changed. So, I mean, yes, they're physically changed, and I'm not going to spoil it, but I don't really see that much character growth, and that's part of the frustration of this book for me. Also, in addition to that, I was actually liking this series, I would say, quite a bit through the first half of the first book. But then after that, the pacing to me was just all over the place. There's things that should have taken a really long time, in my opinion, that got condensed down into really short periods. There's characters that get introduced and then disappear. I just think this trilogy is a little bit of a mess. And so for me, R.F. Kuang's The Poppy Wars and the third book in this series, not the greatest. That being said, The Burning God of the 3 books is actually the best. I think part of that is R.F. Kuang over time improved as a writer, and so her pacing has improved. And I've also heard that her other books, Babel and Yellowface, are actually even better written. So at some point in the future, I might try those out, but I'm not in any kind of hurry. Moving on to number 16 on the list, it is Cryptonomicon by Neal Stephenson. Now, Cryptonomicon is the third Stevenson book that I've read, in addition to Seven Eves and Reamdi. Both of those books I enjoyed quite a bit. Seven Eves is actually probably my favorite of the 3. But that's a little bit of an idiosyncratic choice. So for most people, I would actually probably recommend Reamdi as a more accessible or more, I guess, broadly appealing book to get started with Stevenson on. But I enjoy both of those books quite a bit, and I enjoy Neal Stephenson's writing. Yes, it is long. Yes, he is long-winded. Yes, he takes a lot of time getting to the point sometimes. But one of the things I appreciate about Stevenson is sort of his narrator's voice is a little bit caustic, and he's got this wit that sort of shines through. And I just really sort of enjoy reading that. That being said, Cryptonomicon of the 3 books that I read was by far my least favorite. It's also, I think, the earliest of the 3 that I have read, and one of Stevenson's earlier works. Cryptonomicon is really long, just like most of Stevenson's works, but unlike some of the other stuff that I've read, the characters just aren't all that interesting. They seem very two-dimensional. The plot is not all that engaging. There's jumping back and forth in timelines, which doesn't really seem to be all that appealing. And throughout this entire thing, frankly, I just don't care about what the characters are after. And for most of the book, I don't even think the characters themselves know what they're after. So Cryptonomicon, aside from the fact that I still enjoy Stevenson's writing style, and there's places where it's witty and memorable and I enjoyed sort of the style, the story itself, the characters themselves fell sort of flat for me on this one. So Cryptonomicon, not super high up on my list of summer reads. Next up on the list is Saga Volume 10. So this one actually really hurts me personally to put this book so low on my list. This is one of 2 graphic novels on the list. The other one, as you might guess, is quite a bit higher up on the list. So Saga is one of my favorite comic book series of all time. I love Brian K. Vaughan as a writer. I think Fiona Staples' art is absolutely beautiful. I think this series has just been one of the most consistently excellent series that has been out there ever, and especially one of the current ongoing series that exist in sort of the Western graphic novel medium. That being said, Volume 10, of all 10 volumes of Saga that are currently out, for me, by far the most disappointing. I think part of that might be just how long we had to wait for this to come out, to have to wait so long between Volume 9 and Volume 10, and then have Volume 10 just sort of be okay, was part of the disappointment. The other thing that didn't really work for me is I feel like the events that happen in volume 9, the payoff for them didn't really happen in volume 10, and I don't know if this is because of the amount of time that elapsed between writing the previous volume and the current volume, but also some of the characters sort of seemed out of character to me. Specifically, and again, I don't want to ruin anything in the story, but some of the more antagonistic characters, which throughout the series have always been more of morally gray, if you will, definitely on the sort of quote-unquote villain side of the spectrum, but with sort of these redeeming qualities nonetheless. By the time you get to this volume, I feel like they have just gone full-on heel, and it seems just a little bit out of character, and so I didn't really connect with that. Now, that being said, I might be overly harsh on this, because I will fully admit that by the time I got to the end of this book, I still did find myself choking up. And I cannot name too many books, let alone too many graphic novels, that could actually bring me to tears. And somehow Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples managed to do it on a consistent basis. So this is still a really good book, just not up to par with the rest of the books in the Saga series, in my humble opinion. And that's why it sits where it does on the list. At number 14 on the list, I'm a little bit late to this party, but it is Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. So Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. And this is the second Isaacson biography that I have read. The first one was the Leonardo da Vinci biography. I'm a big Leonardo da Vinci fan, I guess you will. It's a little bit weird to be a fan of a guy who's been dead for 500 years. But anyway, that being said, I enjoyed Walter Isaacson's Leonardo da Vinci biography. I also enjoyed his Steve Jobs biography, but I do have to say, I spent a lot of my career working in tech and in product management specifically, and also working with people who are from the same sort of general area that Apple is from. And so I never met Steve Jobs personally, but I have worked with people who have worked with him. And when you work in product management in tech, sort of the legend of Steve Jobs is sort of pervasive. And so I did go into this book knowing a lot of Jobs' life already. And so I didn't learn all that much reading through this sort of 600-700 page long biography. That being said, I do have to give Isaacson credit for doing what he does really well, which is taking sort of these elements of a life which oftentimes can be sort of disconnected and don't really have any specific connecting tissue, and weaving a really nice, compelling narrative story throughout. And so Isaacson does a really great job of that. I think when it comes to biographies, especially biographies of an individual like Steve Jobs, it's really hard to sort of separate the book from the person. And that is one of the things that I think is a little bit challenging with me and regarding this book. I finished this book, and the question that it leaves me with, and I think maybe this is, I don't know if this is intentional on Isaacson's part, but this is definitely how it comes off, is you sort of have to ask yourself, okay, maybe Steve Jobs arguably is one of our modern geniuses, but he is also unquestionably a giant. So do you need to be one in order to be the other? And could he have been just a nicer person and still have achieved what he achieved? Because in order to achieve what he did, he left sort of a path of emotional wreckage in his wake. However, I do have to be fair here, because one of the things that really impressed me about Jobs, more so than Isaacson in this case, and I didn't know this, is when you read through this book, one of the things that's really impressive is that despite the fact that this man obviously had some unresolved emotional issues, and he was difficult to work with and difficult to be around, and he was emotionally disconnected, all of those things, his family and his closest friends were still 100% behind him and in his corner, which I don't think a lot of people would be able to say if they behaved like we think that Steve Jobs did. So, somewhere along the lines, maybe he wasn't as much of a monster as he is portrayed to be, and as frankly, maybe as the stories in Isaacson's book lead us to believe that he was, because he definitely has really strong proponents, really strong boosters out there. One way or another, if you don't know much about Steve Jobs, he is someone who, undeniably had an impact, whether or not you believe he changed the world, as many people do, or you think he was just kind of a really good businessman. Either way, obviously an important figure in the 20th and 21st century. And if you want to know a little bit more about him, I would definitely suggest Walter Isaacson's biography, because Isaacson definitely knows how to write a good biography. And at number 13 on the list, I have The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Andrew George translation, the Penguin Classics edition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, I did an entire video about it. I'll link to it somewhere up here. So if you're interested in it, definitely go check out that video, because that video gives you a list of reasons why I definitely think you should read The Epic of Gilgamesh. But if I had to summarize it in as short a bit as I could, I would say the most impressive thing about The Epic of Gilgamesh is that it is a 4,000-year-old story that reads incredibly modern, with themes that anyone could relate to in the 21st century. Themes of brotherhood, themes of insecurity, themes of sort of legacy and loss and fear of death. All of these things that, were a story from 4,000 years ago, still anyone could definitely resonate with today. And on top of that, just written in such a way that it's really a fun read. So I would definitely recommend that anyone who is interested in the ancient classics, check out The Epic of Gilgamesh. Like I said, check out my video if you want to know more about that. Okay, now I'm going to combine two books here, bundle them together at column numbers 11 and 12. The two books that I am going to talk about now are The Elements of Style by Strunk and White and On Writing Well by William Zinsser. I'll be completely honest, guys, I threw them in here sort of in the middle of the list because I didn't know where else to put them. It's really hard to put these sort of instructional books into a list about mostly fiction, a little bit of nonfiction in there as well. So where these really fit in the list, hard to say. I'm throwing them in here around the middle. Maybe you disagree, I don't know. But I definitely wanted to talk about these two books because these are books that are really important to me personally. I've been writing for probably over 2 decades now, and The Elements of Style is a book that I return to on a regular basis. I probably read the entire book once every year or two. And On Writing Well is a book that I had heard about for a really long time, but I only just recently picked up because now, in addition to doing my own writing, I'm actually teaching writing to business school students, and so I wanted to sort of make sure that my own personal experience was being supplemented by people who, have been teaching this for a really long time. And William Zinsser's On Writing Well is sort of the gold standard for nonfiction writing and writing style. And the one thing I can say about both of these books is they are books about how to write, but they themselves are so incredibly well written that you can't help but pay attention to what they say, because if I could write half as well as Strunk and White or William Zinsser, and they can give me any tips on how to get there, clearly they've done their job. So both of these, for anyone who's looking to improve their writing, highly, highly, highly recommend. And, as a cherry on top, they're actually really funny in some places too. So some of the examples are given of poor writing versus good writing. They're really enjoyable reads. So, how often can you say that you're learning a really valuable skill and having a good time doing it at the same time? So really great books, highly recommend. Okay, now we're going to jump through a big chunk of the list all at once. And this is going to be sort of numbers 10 all the way up to 5, because I'm grouping a whole bunch of books in the same series together, because if I tried to talk about them separately, they would just kind of pollute the entire list. And so I'm going to kind of take an average of all the books and sort of drop them here in the 5 to 10 spot. And those books are books 3 through 8 of the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. So The Expanse you might have heard of as a television series. The Expanse television series happens to be my second favorite sci-fi series of all time. And so when I first started watching this series, I thought it was excellent. I found out it was based on a series of books. So after I watched the first season of The Expanse, I immediately went and picked up the first volume in the Expanse series, the first novel, Leviathan Wakes. And I read that before watching season 2. My first impression of Leviathan Wakes was okay, lukewarm. It wasn't something that I was thrilled about. It was one of those instances where the TV series, the adaptation, was actually superior to the novel, in my opinion. And so I watched the rest of that series without having read the novels. After the series ended, I wanted to go back and read the novels, especially because the series ends after 6 seasons, and it's more or less 1 season per book, and there's 9 books in the book series, and so there's more of a story after the books end. And so I wanted to kind of see how that played out, so I went back to the novels. And what I found out as I went back to the novels was as you go further into this series of books, the better the series becomes. I think in some ways the first season was better than the first book because they had the advantage of having all the other books and taking the best parts of the other books and pulling them forward into that first season. So things like taking some really great characters from later in the series and pulling them forward in the series, in the TV series. Prime example, Christian Avasarala, who is one of the most entertaining characters in sci-fi literature I can think of. Aging Indian grandmother who swears like a sailor and is just sharp as a tack, and who just has a phenomenal sort of presence and is great in this series in every way, shape, and form. She got to be in every season of the TV series. She's only in a handful of the books. So some of the ways that the TV series was able to benefit from the books being over. That being said, as the series has progressed, and I'm not done the book series yet, like I said, I ended with Tiamat's Wrath, which is book 8. I still have to read book 9, but books 3 through 8 just sort of consistently got better and better and better and better. And the books that overlapped with the TV series, oftentimes I felt enjoying, but maybe feeling like I've lost a little bit of the punch because I knew what was going to happen from the TV series already. The TV series is a very faithful adaptation of the books up until the 6th season, because book 6 changes pretty considerably from season 6, because book 6 then sets up book 7, 8, and 9. And so the further you go in this series, the better the series gets. Out of the books that I've read so far, probably my favorite is book 6, Babylon's Ashes, maybe tied with book 7, Persepolis Rising. Either way, excellent series of books, fantastic characters, and it's just really impressive to me how the story that was developed in 1 book is being carried through 9 books later. The foresight for telling such a huge story on such a massive scope is just incredible to me. The other thing that I want to say about this series, and the other reason I think it gets better as it goes on, is the characters sort of come into their own. And whereas at the beginning of the book series, the author or authors, because James S.A. Corey is actually 2 authors writing under a symbol pen name, the authors limit themselves to a very narrow set of POV characters and sort of stick to those few POV characters for the entirety of a book. Whereas in the later books, they're a little bit more loose with their POV characters, and so you'll have characters who will only have 1 or 2 POV chapters, and then others who will have more, and they'll sort of pick and choose whatever characters they want to best tell the story, and I think that really works in their favor. The other thing about characters that I will say that Corey does really well is some of the character archetypes are archetypes that you would think maybe wouldn't be all that appealing. And I'll give as an example the main protagonist, James Holden. James Holden, for all intents and purposes, is one of those characters who really shouldn't be all that compelling. He's kind of got this sort of Boy Scout vibe to him. Think sort of Superman or Captain America, kind of like clean cut, always does the right thing, really strong moral compass. Generally, those are the types of characters that you want your kids to grow up to be like, but you're not necessarily super interested in reading about. Corey does a really great job of portraying someone like Holden in a way that his character is really interesting because you see sort of the flaws in him and sort of the downsides to being the way that he is. So really great job, really great series, really looking forward to finishing it up. And probably once I do, I will probably do an entire video just on The Expanse TV series versus books. And so keep an eye out for that. At the number 4 spot, this one's going to be really quick. It is Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. I did an entire reading vlog on Gardens of the Moon where I mostly gushed about how great this book was and sort of reserved a few thoughts of where I thought it could have maybe been a little bit better. But if I can kind of summarize that, I will say the parts that most people complain about in the Malazan series, of which Gardens of the Moon is book 1, I think are actually its greatest strengths. I don't think it's nearly as complex as people say that it is, and I think that it does what it does really, really well, and the things that it doesn't do all that well are really not all that distracting. And so, like I said, you can check out my reading vlog for more on that, but definitely excellent fantasy novel, and I would highly recommend this one. Number 3 on the list is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. Best Served Cold is a standalone fantasy novel, and so it's not part of a trilogy, although it is part of the First Law world in which Joe Abercrombie writes most of his novels. So the original First Law trilogy is one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. I actually have a video talking about my favorite fantasy series of all time if you want to check that out. And after having read that trilogy, I never thought that I would get to see Abercrombie reach the same heights as he did in terms of developing characters that I loved as much as the characters I loved in that series. Characters like Logan Ninefingers and Sandan Glokta, two of the greatest characters in fantasy ever created, in my humble opinion. I never thought I would see him come anywhere close to that. And I don't know if he necessarily achieved it with this novel, but he comes really close with the characters of Monza and Casca, who just are phenomenal characters, just as all Abercrombie characters are. So complex, so nuanced, so fun. I just really, really love Abercrombie and the way he writes. The other thing I will say about Best Served Cold is the single biggest knock most people have of the original First Law trilogy is that it is light on plot or story. You cannot say that about Best Served Cold because there is definitely a very clear narrative arc throughout this book, and I think Best Served Cold might actually be an even better book than any of the 3 first books that Joe Abercrombie wrote. So phenomenal book, and definitely deserves its spot this high up on my list of favorite summer reads. All right, we're coming up to the end here, and now we are going to talk about pick number 2 on my list, and that is The Nice House on the Lake, Volume 2 by James Tynion, and the artist is Alvaro Martinez Bueno. Now, Tynion and Martinez Bueno are a team that have worked together in the past. The Nice House on the Lake, Volume 1, probably my favorite graphic novel that I read in 2022. Volume 2, which came out in 2023, just as good, if not better, than Volume 1. I don't care if you don't read horror, which this is. I don't care if you don't read graphic novels, which this obviously is. You need to check out this book. It is just one of the best stories I have ever read, and the way it is done is such a fresh and interesting take on an old trope. I will not say more because it will spoil the story, and what is great about this book is the story, in addition to how beautiful it is. I can't say enough good things about this book. All I can say is do yourself a favor, pick this up. You will not be disappointed. The worst case scenario here is it is a really quick read. You can even stop reading after Volume 2 because in some ways the first portion of the broader story ends here, and so it is a good point to say I have wrapped this up. It's worth your time. Reading both Volume 1 and Volume 2 will take, a few hours at most, but they are hours definitely well spent. Do yourself a favor, pick up The Nice House on the Lake. You will not regret it. All right, and now the number 1 book on this list, which frankly surprised the heck out of me. The number 1 book on this list, I'm not going to leave you in suspense, is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. Now, I have never read anything else by Cheryl Strayed. I don't even think this book was recommended to me by anyone. It was just a book that I picked up on a whim in a used bookstore and started reading through it. Ostensibly, Wild is a memoir about one woman's trek through the Pacific Crest Trail, but that's not really what this book is about. Wild is a book about love. It's a book about loss. It's about how love changes. It's a book about finding your true identity, dealing with grief. It's a book about so many things. There is so much deep human feeling in here, and the way Strayed writes is just so powerful and emotional and gripping. And like I said, I wasn't expecting too much when I picked up this book. I can't even really tell you why I picked up this book, but boy am I glad that I did, because this book had me hooked from the very beginning. It tugged at my heartstrings. I'm not shy to say that I cried a couple of different times while reading this book. Wild by Cheryl Strayed is a book that, I know I'm not the first person to read this, I'm not the first person to talk about it, but it is so very different from the types of books that I normally read, and I absolutely love this. Like I said, I haven't read anything else by Strayed before. I don't know if there's anything else by her that I would necessarily connect with as deeply, but this specific book was just one of those things that hit me in the gut like a gut punch and is going to stay with me for a really long time. So Wild by Cheryl Strayed, my number one book of the summer of 2023. It is a fantastic read, and even for someone like me who doesn't tend to read these types of books, just so wonderful, so impactful. I don't know what else to say. It's actually got me a little bit speechless. But there you go. There you have it. That is my ranking of every single book that I read this past summer. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you found some books in there that you might want to pick up. And what books did you read this summer? What was your favorite read or discovery of the last few months? And tell me about a book that surprised you, that kind of came out of left field and left you surprised by just how good it was. Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time, happy reading.